You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Monday, December 17th, 2018. This week on the Catholic Sprouts podcast, we are going to continue our journey through the Jesse tree, which, as you know by now, is a long list of ancestors that lived before Jesus Christ. As we look at the ancestors of Jesus, we begin to see all of the ways that God was trying to teach these people to change their hearts so that they might be prepared to welcome the Savior that He had promised them. We talked about what happened in the Garden of Eden. We talked about Cain and Abel, Abraham and Isaac. And last week we spent a lot of time talking about Moses and how God chose him to do His work to free the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. Well, of course, they were freed. They went to the Promised Land, and although there were people already living there, they did God's work and they established a home for themselves there. Now, today we are going to look at the character of Ruth. Ruth lived many generations after the Israelites had been freed from Egypt, and Ruth was actually not an Israelite. But Ruth has a beautiful story nonetheless. If you want to read about her, she has an entire book in the Bible called Ruth, and it's pretty short. So if you are able, I encourage you to read it. So here's a little bit about Ruth. So Ruth was married to a man, but that man died, and she was left alone with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law, Naomi, was an Israelite, and after her son died, and actually another son died as well, she decided that she wanted to go back to the land of the Israelites. She wanted to go live with her people. And she told Ruth to go back to her own family and stay there with her own people. But Ruth refused to abandon her mother-in-law. She said, "I will go with you no matter where you go, even if I have to live among strangers." So Ruth and Boaz went back to the town of Bethlehem. They settled there, and after a couple of years, Ruth remarried to a man who was an Israelite. Ruth converted to the faith of the Israelites, and she believed in the God of the Israelites, in Yahweh. She was a faithful and good woman, a good mother, and she actually went on to be the great-grandmother of King David, one of the most important people in the lineage of Jesus Christ. He was a faithful man and a good king. And Ruth, a woman who was not even a member of the Israelite nation, is part of his family tree. Now, there are many beautiful things that we can learn from the story of Ruth, but my challenge for you today, Sprouts, is to learn this. God can use anyone to do His work, and oftentimes He chooses the most unlikely people to do His work. He chooses people that are strange, that aren't even that smart or that strong, or people that aren't even a member of His chosen nation. He can use anyone, and He can use you. Sometimes we think that the great work of converting the world to love Jesus Christ should be done by other people, by people that are saints. But let me tell you, my friends, all saints started out as sinners, and they all started out as children. So each one of you can become a saint, and each one of you can play a role in His great and beautiful story. Remember that, live that, and be faithful to what God asks you to do. That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God intended you to be. one final word to the grown-ups. Thank you so much for listening to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. I would like to invite you to join a special Facebook group just for those that listen to the Catholic Sprouts podcast. We will use this group to connect, to share resources around that week's theme, and simply celebrate raising future saints. To find the direct link to the Facebook group, simply check the notes for this podcast episode.